Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the Lab 1 video for Active Directory in Server 2003. In this video, we're going to take a look at exactly how to get Active Directory onto a Server 2003 machine, including the proper setup of DNS, proper setup of Active Directory using DC Promo, and then adding a second domain controller as well, so we have replication taking place back and forth within our network. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at Active Directory and domains. And what we really want to make sure is that everybody has a real good comfort level for exactly what a domain is, first off. Okay, and a domain is just a collection of computers and servers that are part of the same centralized database. Okay, and definitions are tough sometimes to really put your finger on exactly what we're talking about. But when we say a domain, first off, we're kind of contrasting this with just a workgroup environment. And if you're not familiar with it, a workgroup environment, this is what you have when you first install XP or you first install 2000 or 2003. You have to create this domain environment. Okay, and some of the purposes of creating a domain, well, it gives a centralized user and group authentication. If you have just 2 or 3 systems sitting around and they're not part of a domain, everybody's having to log on separately. If you try to access a shared folder or a printer off of somebody else's system, you might have to know their username and password. Okay? So that becomes difficult, trying to coordinate that information back and forth. Centralized security is another reason for domains. Okay, centralized security meaning the ability to control the user or computer environment from one computer across the whole entire network. Okay, what I'm thinking of specifically here, is group policies. Not only group policies, but even NTFS permissions. Okay, being able to set who can access what particular file, who can access the internet, restricting the desktop. All of this can be controlled, but only in a domain environment. If you're working, in just a normal workgroup environment where you don't have a server running Active Directory, well, then you don't get that advantage. Active Directory also includes a searchable database of resources, including users, computers, shared folders, printers, and more. Okay, and think of this as kind of like a phone book, yellow pages of the phone book. If you wanted to look something up, whether it was a pizza place or a doctor or something else like that, you can refer to the yellow pages in the phone book and quickly find several different pizza places in order to place an order for pizza. In Active Directory, you can kind of do the same thing. If you're looking for a particular user, you can search based upon what group they're part of, what their last name is, what department they're in, where they're located. Okay, any of the information populated within the Active Directory database can be searched for. Okay, so that's what we mean by searchable database. It's also very scalable, okay, and very scalable. Basically, it means that in this context that it can be used in a very small environment. We use a domain environment here. We're a fairly small company, yet it can also be used in the largest of large environments. Okay, Microsoft runs a domain environment. Larger companies than Microsoft that are spread across the world can run a domain environment, and it works equally well for small companies or for large companies. And it's really required to reap the full benefits of Server 2003. If you're not using Active Directory, if you don't have a domain installed, well, you're not going to be able to use non-local group policies where we set all these group policy settings. And there's a whole slew of other things that you just can't do if you don't have Active Directory installed. And one of these, just another aside, is using Microsoft Exchange Server. Okay, it runs in a Windows 2000 Active Directory environment or a Server 2003 Active Directory environment, and that's one thing you wouldn't be able to run without Active Directory. Okay, we keep referring to this Active Directory. Let's make sure that we're all comfortable with exactly what it is. Okay, so Active Directory. This is the name for Microsoft's directory service. They had to come up with a marketing name. This is what they chose. A directory service is similar to what we described so far. It's just kind of like that phone book type feature that allows us to organize all the resources within our network together in one unified database. Okay, and this is similar to something Novell has had out for a longer time than Microsoft. Their directory service is named NDS, or Novell Directory Service. Microsoft always has a knack for marketing, and I think they've outnamed Novell's. Active Directory kind of has a newer ring to it or something. So same concept, just a different name. Now, here's some features or just general facts that you should know about Active Directory and domains. DC Promo, this is what's used to install Active Directory onto a Server 2003 computer. Installing Active Directory on a Server 2003 computer is what actually turns it into a domain controller. I have students sometimes who kind of get confused by this. A lot of times I will refer interchangeably to Active Directory or domain controller because they essentially mean the same thing. If you have Active Directory installed on a Server 2003 computer, it is a domain controller. If I say I have a domain controller, that means Active Directory has been installed on it. So just keep that straight in your head. When you install Active Directory, okay, so we go through DC Promo, which installs it, we reboot, our system is up and running, it creates a database file named ntds.dit, ntdirectoryservices.dit. Okay, so this you can go look for. You cannot open this up, by yourself. You can't just go to it, right-click on it, and try to open it up with, Word or Access or something. To open this file, you have to use the Active Directory tools that come with Windows Server 2003. And these include Active Directory users and computers, Active Directory sites and services, and also some command line tools that will allow you to access this database as well. Now, when you install Active Directory, also bear in mind that it disables the local user and groups tool. Okay, so this tool before Active Directory is how we created all of our users and groups. Once you install Active Directory onto a Windows 2003 machine server, this tool is going to be disabled, and users and groups now are created only within Active Directory users and computers. Okay, before we get started, requirements. Some things we need to have before we really get going. Well, we need to have the CD. Okay, now you may not need it, you may need it, but a lot of times, especially if you have to do anything with DNS, it's going to ask you for the Server 2003 CD, so anytime you're really making changes, you should always have the CD handy, or the source files from the CD copied over to the hard drive somewhere. You're going to have an NTFS partition. Most likely you're running this, so it's probably not a big deal, but if you don't have an NTFS partition, Active Directory is not going to work. You have to have a network card, go figure, and that's got to be plugged into a network. This is kind of a gotcha for me. When I first tried installing Active Directory in Windows 2000, I was running it on a laptop, and it was not plugged into a network. And this really doesn't give you a specific error message, but if you don't have your computer either plugged into a hub, a switch, or into another computer even with a crossover cable, DC Promo, installing Active Directory, this will fail. So this is definitely a requirement. TCP/IP configured properly. Okay, don't just type in DC Promo and start trying to install Active Directory until you've taken the time to go through and set up TCP/IP. It's got to be configured first and foremost, otherwise you're going to have all sorts of errors and issues. And that's what we did previously in the lab setup video. If you haven't watched that, make sure you go back and check that out so you know exactly what type of environment we're starting off with here. Okay, DNS. Here's another very, very important piece in Active Directory. This is something that you can install ahead of time before you install Active Directory, or there's actually a component within the Active Directory wizard that will allow you to install DNS. My preference, anytime I'm trying to get Active Directory up and working properly, is to install DNS first. Okay, so you can install DNS first, make sure that it's working, then install Active Directory, and overall you'll have a lot better luck, doing it in this manner. Okay, before we get started on the actual configuration, let's take a quick peek at a couple different diagrams here to make sure we're comfortable with what's going on. So this is just the lab setup diagram that we had shown before. This is basically what we have installed here locally on this machine, locally on this network, I should say. So we have 3 different machines here. This is representative of our San Francisco office, and that's in reference to this diagram here. Okay, this is in effect what we're setting up. We're going to be building a domain, benandbrady.com, and what we're going to do here is build first the San Francisco office. Now, this is physically located in San Francisco. We're going to have a domain controller located in San Francisco, and our XP machine will exist here. Now, we're not really building this wide area network infrastructure, so don't get worried about this too much. We'll also be building, at least in simulation, the Charlotte side of things. Okay, so there's 2 different offices that make up the Ben and Brady Ice Cream Company. We've got Charlotte and San Francisco. And over on this side, we're really going to have the same thing. We've got a domain controller that exists over here. And we have more Windows 2000 or XP systems that are running on the workstation. So this is just kind of a logical overview to give you a feel for what's going on. And our big task here in Lab 1 will be to configure replication between the two different Server 2003 machines. Now, so we're not lost in what's going on here. Let me reiterate something. We're creating one domain. Okay, there's just going to be one domain in this exercise, benandbrady.com. And instead of creating two domains, like we could if we wanted to, in Server 2003 and in Windows 2000, the recommendation is try to consolidate and make as few domains as possible. So that's what we're going to do. Secondly, a lot of people will ask, well, what about sites? Okay, and if you're not that familiar with sites, I'll give you just a brief overview. Active Directory sites are used to physically separate your offices. So I could create a site basically for San Francisco and a site for Charlotte. Actually, we'll use this other diagram here. So it looked something like this. Okay, one Active Directory domain, two sites, San Francisco and North Carolina, domain controller in San Francisco, and a domain controller in North Carolina. Okay, and if you have very limited bandwidth, like we see here, 128 kilobits per second, what a site will do is to make replication more efficient. It actually compresses it before it's sent across the wide area network. And it also will work because you can schedule when replication is going to take place. You can have it occur every 3 hours, every 8 hours, once a day. Okay, and normal Active Directory replication takes place much more often. Up to every minute. Can't say for sure, but between a minute, 3 minutes or so is the typical amount of time it takes to replicate changes back and forth. Okay, and that would take up a lot of bandwidth across here. This is not what we're setting up, however. We're going to focus in on just the domain setup. So we're going to have a domain controller, and what we'll be doing is focus in on creating organizational units to separate these out. So we're going to worry about the administration side, and we'll leave sites completely alone. Okay, so we'll focus in on this. Let's go ahead and get started then. And the first thing we need to do is connect over to Server 1 and set up DNS. So we're going to do this before we install Active Directory. Wrong button. Okay, so we're going to form a remote desktop connection over to Server 1. And we'll have to go through several steps in order to get DNS installed on this system. And we'll do a brief overview. The focus point of this lab is more an Active Directory, so we won't go into DNS in nearly as much depth as we see in the DNS video lab. Okay, so we're going to go up to Add or Remove Programs, Add or Remove Windows Components, okay, one of these days this will come up. Okay, then we need to go down to Networking Services. Make sure you don't check the entire box and just select DNS. That's what we're going to be using for right now. So I click OK, then click Next. Okay, and you will need the CD. That's what I did in the meantime there. I popped in the CD. Looks like I popped it into the wrong computer. Let's see here. It'll ask us here in a second if I did. What we'll do in the meantime, I'll stop this while this is installing. No need for you to watch this. And I'll start this up again as soon as it's done with the copying process. Okay, DNS is back running, so just click Finish here. And we'll continue on from here. So we're still over on Server 1, as you can see up here. And now we'll go to the tool itself here within Administrative Tools and open up DNS. Alright, now before we even get into DNS, you really need to do some planning. Sit down with a pencil and paper and decide exactly what you're going to name your Microsoft domain. Because if you make a mistake here, it kind of really be a pain in the butt. Now in Server 2003, yeah, we can rename our domain controllers, and yeah, we can rename our domains, but it's still not something I would want to do. It's going to be extra steps, and I just get a feeling like, hey, that might cause some problems. So I think you're much better off taking the time up front and making sure you plan out a proper name for whatever company you're setting up. Now in this case here, we're setting up a forward lookup zone, which will be required for any domain, and we're going to set this up for benandbrady.com, which is the name of our Active Directory domain that we'll be using. Okay, so this is just the default is great here. Okay, then we have a choice here to either not allow dynamic updates or allow both non-secure and secure dynamic updates. Okay, now we definitely want to use dynamic updates. Okay, so this is something we need to do. However, we can't do secure dynamic updates until we're running Active Directory and we have the ability to use Active Directory integrated zones. So that's why you see this option grayed out here. Okay, so you don't necessarily have to do this now, but we're going to have to go back in and make a manual change if we left the default selected here. So this is something we want to do, and I'll show you where this change would take place as soon as we get done creating this forward lookup zone. Fairly straightforward. I click Finish, and now you see here I've got my forward lookup zone. Now what I was talking about a second ago, if you right click on this zone and then go to Properties, here's what we're talking about with the dynamic updates. Okay, we can go to None, or we can set non-secure and secure. And it tells us right here, allowing non-secure dynamic updates is a significant security vulnerability because updates can be accepted from untrusted sources. Now, on an internal network, this isn't nearly as big of a deal as it would be if you're hosting a public DNS server. Okay, but we'll save that, for the DNS lab. So we're going to leave this as it is. Don't really need to do anything else with it. Click OK here. And then we're going to also create a reverse lookup zone. And this is not required, but I like to create it just for troubleshooting purposes. And the reverse lookup zone is populated with the subnet that we're working with. Okay, and for this particular zone, we have a network ID of 192.168.1, and that's the number it uses to create this zone file name here. We'll do the non-secure and secure dynamic updates again. Click Next, and then click Finish. Now, we have a couple things that we can do here. We can either manually create this host record, which we're going to do. Okay, so we need to go in here. What we're actually doing is creating a host record for Server 1. If we look over here right now, Server 1 doesn't have an entry within the DNS database. So what we're going to do for Server 1 is create a host record within this zone, which is necessary to get Active Directory up and running. So I specify Server 1, and now its IP address. Okay, if I click this, this will create a PTR record in my reverse lookup zone. Okay, and it tells us that it was successfully created. Now if I look here, I see that I have Server 1 here, and I should have it again down here, and I do. Okay, so here we see it, Server 1, and this is necessary. If you're not familiar with DNS, this is how we do our host name resolution. Active Directory is dependent upon a properly functioning DNS, and that's why we're worrying about setting this up right now. Now, one more thing I told you about, we'll do a quick configuration here, and this is definitely not meant to be a thorough overview, but we talked about in the lab setup video how we changed our IP address for the preferred DNS server, and they wouldn't be able to connect out to the internet anymore. And I wanted to make sure that you always have your local systems, okay, within a domain pointing to the DNS server. Well, the point I made was a lot of people get spooked by this because all of a sudden their internet doesn't work anymore. Well, to make that work, you have to set up what's called a forwarder, and this is done on the DNS server itself by right-clicking up here on the actual name of the server, going to Properties, and then going to the Forwarders tab. Okay, now down here, this is where we can specify the domain name of our ISP, or the IP address of our ISP, and we were using a IP address from Earthlink before. We'll use the same one. Okay, and you can add several if you want to. We'll just add this one IP address. Okay, and then we click OK, and that's all you need to do. Now if I go back here to my XP machine, let's try to connect out to the internet once again. Okay, you see we're able to actually connect out to the internet, even though my preferred DNS server setting, if we go up here and look at this, is pointing over to 192.168.1.201, a local system. Okay, so this is real important. This is how you get the best of both worlds, because otherwise, what I've seen people do before, they'll change this to the internet when they need to connect to the internet, okay, and then they will change it back to the local DNS server when they need to log on to their domain, and that's silly. This should be pointing to your local DNS server, and then using that forwarders technique that I just showed you, that's what connects you out to the internet. Okay, this is the proper way of setting this up. Okay, so that's all we really need to do for DNS. We've got that set up. The things that are critical, we definitely have to make sure there's a host record here. That's important. We have to make sure that dynamic updates are enabled, and we see that we do have dynamic updates, non-secure and secure. That needs to be enabled. Okay, and then the third thing that's very important is the IP information. You need to make sure that the server where you're installing the domain controller, is pointing properly to the DNS server. And in this case, this machine where we're going to be running DC Promo actually is the DNS server as well, so it's pointing to itself. So this preferred DNS server, whether this DNS server is here locally on the same machine or someplace else on another computer on the network, that's where this machine should be pointing to. And that takes us to the next step, where we're actually ready to go into the Active Directory wizard and run DC Promo. So this is very similar to Windows 2000. We just need to go to Start, Run, and then type in DC Promo. We'll hit Enter, and it starts us on the Active Directory installation wizard. So clicking Next brings us up to our first change in Server 2003, and this is a security enhancement, which you'll see a lot of in Server 2003. Now it tells us right here the following older versions of Windows cannot meet the new requirements, and that is Windows 95 and any NT 4.0 version previous to Service Pack 4. Now, nobody runs NT4 Service Pack 3 or earlier, or they have so many other security issues it's not even an issue. So this one's not a big deal, and by this time, I mean, people really need to upgrade Windows 95. It's very unsecure, so it's time to get that up to at least 98, and hopefully they're running even a newer Windows operating system such as XP. And the exact situation, what's going on here, Server 2003 uses SMB, Server Message Block Signing. So all communication during the authentication process is digitally signed. Okay, and Windows 95 and NT 4.0 Service Pack 3 or earlier do not have the capability of supporting this. Windows 98, by the way, Windows Millennium, out of the box also do not have this capability, and what they need to do is have the Active Directory client installed on them. Let's go ahead and click Next here, and the next choice we have is very similar to what we saw before, domain controller for a new domain, or do we want to create an additional domain controller for an existing domain? Now, we don't have a domain already set up, so we're going to choose this top option here. This bottom option is what we'll be using when we get onto the Server 11 machine when we're installing Active Directory on it. So we're going to select Domain Controller for a brand new domain, and it tells us right here this option will create a new child domain, new domain tree, or a new forest, so we don't really know exactly which one we're specifying yet. This server will become the first domain controller in this new domain. Let's take a look at a diagram real quick here to maybe clarify this point to you. Okay, here's an example of a 3-domain forest. Okay, and this is not what we're setting up, but I want you to see something here. What it's basically saying here, well, if we install this domain, and this is the domain we're on, we could be installing the domain controller for this brand new benandbrady.com domain, which is also the very beginning of the forest. It's also possible, however, that we're going through this Active Directory installation wizard and we're installing a brand new domain controller for this West domain. Okay, so what it's saying there is it's not necessarily the forest root. It could be just a new domain that you're creating that's going to be a child domain of this, forest root domain that we see up here. Okay, so that's what it is. We're going to go ahead and click Next. And then our next choice here is where we differentiate this. Okay, is this a new domain in a new forest, which it is going to be? Is it a child domain in an existing domain tree? And that's what we just showcased here a second ago. If it were a child domain, it would be like the West or the East domain sitting underneath the benandbrady.com domain. And then we have our third choice, a domain tree in an existing forest. So we don't have a diagram of that, but that would be the equivalent of having just another domain over here. Sometimes you'll see diagrams like this, and you'll see that other domain here, and they will have a discontiguous namespace. So this domain over here would be something like wiredbraincoffee.com. Doesn't really matter what it is, it's just not going to be anything having to do with Ben and Brady. Okay, that's what we have when we have a new tree. Okay, connecting back over to our server then, we are going to select this top option, a domain in a new forest. Click Next, and now it's time to actually name the domain. And this is very important. You don't want to make a mistake here. Yes, we can rename the domain, but we'd rather not. It can lead to problems and also aggravation, and it's going to be time consuming regardless. So we type out the domain name as we want it. Okay, and I think this is also a good time to discuss what we can use here for a domain name. I've had several questions with our Windows 2000 product where people are a little bit confused on exactly what they can use for a domain name. Okay, and you have a lot of different options. First and foremost, you don't have to worry necessarily about, public DNS domains. So for example, if I was just going to set up a local domain and this is a test network, I could use Microsoft.com and this would cause no issues whatsoever here on my local domain. There would be some minor issues that we won't go into right now, but just want to make the point that you don't have to match this up either. For example, our public domain is trainsignal.com, and that's how you got to the website to purchase this product, but we could also use that here locally on our internal domain. Okay, so that's perfectly acceptable as well. And there are some advantages and disadvantages to using these domain names, the same domain name or a different domain name. If we use the same domain name, the main advantage is, well, it's continuity. We already are familiar with this name. We can now use the same email address as our domain name. Everything is kind of in sync. The main disadvantage, however, is we also have a harder time distinguishing between our DNS. We're going to have a public DNS and a private DNS. Okay, we're also going to have to do some more configuration on our local systems in order for the local people here to get out to our web server located at www.trainsignal.com. Okay, so this is something that's a little bit difficult to do in a video such as this when we're talking about it, but we do have choices. Another way you can go. A lot of times companies will use a different name, something like .local, because you can really use anything that you want here. It doesn't matter what you specify. Okay, but to boil this down and to make it simpler, I think there's really two main choices that you have. And that's to either A, use the same domain name on the public side as well as the private side. So that would mean that if you have a domain registered, you're going to use the exact same name. Okay, or B, to use a different name. And that different name could be anything. Okay, it doesn't really matter what you're using here. What makes up a good name? Why don't we focus on that? Well, a good name is going to be something that describes your company, is going to be politically correct. So once you name this domain name, keep in mind that people are going to see it all the time. So you want to make sure that it well represents, not just one location of your company, but maybe all locations. And short and simple is typically your best bet as well. Okay, so Ben and Brady's Ice Cream has chosen just to use benandbrady.com. They're going to use just the same name, and we'll change this up. Let's just use, we can't. We already made this. It's going to say let's change this up and use .local like we did, different than what we did in the Windows 2000 videos. But keep in mind we already set up our DNS, and if we change this to something different, well, it's not going to match up with our DNS server, and it's going to cause us problems there. Okay, so we're going to use benandbrady.com and then click Next here. Now what it's doing now, it takes a little bit of time, but it's going out on the network. It's actually searching for a DNS server, and it's checking to see if anybody else is using this domain. So if you happen to have a second instance of whatever domain name you picked out on the network, it is going to return an error message to you. Now we come up with our NetBIOS domain name, and this NetBIOS name is used for down-level Windows clients. And a down-level Windows client is really anything before Windows 2000. That would include NT4, Millennium, 98, 95, so on and so forth. And the newer machines, XP 2000, Server 2003, the newer operating systems, they're capable of using that host name, benandbrady.com. Well, the older machines use this old naming style, so we have to make sure that this domain can be identified using the old naming style as well. Oh, and by the way, let's not change this. Not a good idea to change this to anything else except for the default that comes up here. To have a totally different name would be rather confusing. Okay, here we get to the location of where we want to install our Active Directory database and also where we want to store the Active Directory log file. Okay, now a good idea is to actually store your Active Directory database and your Active Directory log file on different physical hard drives. So if we had a second hard drive here, what I'd really like to do is maybe put my Active Directory database on the C drive and then put the Active Directory log file on the D drive, assuming that's a second physical hard drive. And this is important because if you're running Active Directory, it can be quite busy, and a lot of times the information that's written to the database and the information that's written to the log is written at the same time. So if that hard drive is busy writing one piece of information, the domain controller is just going to function slower. We don't have that luxury here. We just have one hard drive in the system, so we're going to leave this at its default settings and then click Next. Okay, here we see that we have the shared system volume, and if you're an NT4 person, this really replaces the net logon folder. Okay, the sysvol folder stores the server's copy of the domain's public files. It's going to be things like group policies, logon scripts, things along those lines, and any domain controller in a domain will share this sysvol folder automatically. This is not something that you have to configure. We're happy with this typically. This is a good location for it. I don't recommend you change it. Okay, diagnostic results. Okay, now what we need to do, we've come up to the area where we see DNS, okay, and it tells us right here, DNS registration diagnostics. The registration diagnostics has been run one time. The wizard encountered an error while trying to determine if the DNS server with which this domain controller will register supports dynamic updates. So for some reason, this DNS server wasn't quite working properly. So what we can do here first, let's go down here and see if we get a good error message. And all that it really tells us is DNS server failure. Let's try it and see if it happens again. So it says, I've corrected the problem. Perform the DNS diagnostic test again. Okay, so I'm going to click Next, and we get the same thing. Okay, it's not working out. So what a good thing to do would be to go back, stop this process, and make sure that DNS is configured properly. What we're going to do right now, we're going to go ahead and run through DNS, have DNS installed on this system. We'll make sure that it's set up, working properly, though, after we get DNS finished, or after Active Directory is finished up. So we'll click Install and configure the DNS server on this computer. Click Next. Okay, and then we get to the next wizard screen here. We have two choices here when it comes to permissions. One permission is permissions compatible with pre-Windows 2000 server operating systems, and the second is permissions compatible only with 2000 and Server 2003. Now this is a mouthful to read here, but what it really boils down to is right up here, okay? Windows NT Remote Access Services. If you're running a Windows NT 4.0 remote access server, and not too many companies are anymore, but if you were, okay, and you don't plan on upgrading it, you'd want to use permissions compatible with pre-Windows 2000 server operating systems. Okay, now the problem here, there's a security issue in this. So yeah, you're going to have NT4 remote access servers, but you're also making your entire network less secure. So a good solution would be to upgrade that machine to Server 2003 and choose this bottom option. Directory Services Restore Mode Administrator Password. Okay, this is used at the very beginning of Active Directory if you need to do a restore of it. And you can go into a low-level diagnostic version, and to get into this Directory Services Restore mode, you need to supply a password. So on a production network, it's a real good idea to put in a secure password here. And also make sure that you don't forget it. It would not be a good thing if you forgot this password, because you wouldn't be able to get into diagnostic mode to troubleshoot this Active Directory installation. Okay, and then go through these, make sure that everything looks fine, but double check your spelling. benandbrady.com. It's got a net BIOS name of Ben and Brady. All this looks good. Tells me the DNS server will be installed and configured on this computer. This computer will be configured to use this DNS server as its preferred DNS server. What we're going to do right now, I'm going to stop this video, take a quick look and see if there's some little minor issue that I left off, And then what I'll do is I'll start this back up and running again here in a second, and then we'll go and we'll see if the problem is corrected. Okay, after stopping the video, I think I pinpointed what our problem was within DNS. And what we need to do is come back over here to our server. Let's go take a look at the computer name. Okay, and the computer name right now is just server 1. One setting that a lot of people are not familiar with, though, is this primary DNS suffix setting that you can set along with the computer name. And by setting this, when you do set this, let's just type this out and give you a feel for what it does. When you type this as is, what it's going to do is append server1 to benandbrady.com. So the full computer name then would change to server1.benandbrady.com. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. It should show us this name now, as you see there. Okay, because without that name, with just server 1, what's happening is this machine's going, checking in DNS, and it's not finding server 1 in the root of the DNS namespace. Okay, and if you're not sure with what I'm talking about, let's just open up DNS here briefly and take a look. Okay, well, here's an entry for server 1, but server 1 exists within benandbrady.com, this zone. So its full name, in order to find it, it's got to go to server1.benandbrady.com before it's going to work. Okay, so that's what we have here, and that's the reason that DNS is probably not functioning correctly. So what we're going to have to do is click OK a couple times here, and what's going to happen is we're going to have to restart this computer before this change will take place. So we're going to have to stop the video after we've rebooted this computer, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I'm going to stop the video here, and we'll start right back up. And what I'm going to do is get you through the Active Directory process right at that DNS area right before there, so you can see exactly what happens if we had remembered to create this setting before. See you right back here again. Okay, server 1 is back up and running here, so what we're going to do is go through the DC promo process again, and we'll go through it quickly. We're not going to go through it in as much detail as we did the first time. Okay, so we'll just quickly skip through this. Domain controller for a new domain, domain in a new forest, and then the name of the domain just can be exactly the same, benandbrady.com. Just got to make sure we spell it correctly. Okay, and this, like I said before, take a little bit of time. It's going out right now and verifying that benandbrady.com is not duplicated on the network. Okay, and then after this, it'll pull up our NetBIOS name, and we'll accept the default Ben and Brady. The default location is great as far as the Active Directory database and log files concerned. Sysfile folder will stay in the same place. Okay, and here's what we had last time. Keep in mind that it said something quite different. It said basically that it wasn't working properly. And this time when we see it, DNS registration support for this domain controller has been verified. To continue, click Next. Okay, so this is good. This means that it's successful, as it tells us down below, and this is what we're looking for. So remember, this is something that you will have to do, and you won't only be just in this domain controller, but in a second domain controller. Anytime we're adding these machines to the domain, this is something that you'll want to make sure that you do, otherwise you run into naming issues and domain joining issues like we saw. Okay, we'll select this bottom option for more security. Put in our same password here again, and then finally we should be all set and ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video while this is writing. We'll pick up when this resumes, and we'll take a look at what this machine looks like after Active Directory has actually been installed on the machine. And we'll go through and verify, make sure that there's no problems with our Active Directory installation. Okay, DC Promo has finished running on server 1. Server 1 has rebooted, so we're ready to connect back over to server 1 and take a look at our next step. Now, the first thing we want to do after we get Active Directory installed in this computer is check it out. Make sure that everything looks okay. And usually there's no instances where it's messed up. It's very infrequent, I would say, that the Active Directory installation doesn't go over. I think your biggest issue is if you install Active Directory without DNS. You have a lot of cleanup work and testing to ensure that everything is going to go okay. That's not the case because we installed DNS first before we actually went in and did Active Directory. So we shouldn't have those issues here. Nonetheless, we do want to go in and check. So what we're going to do, first, let's go make sure that the tool is actually still here. So we'll go to All Programs, Administrative Tools, and then Active Directory users and computers. And what we're really checking for is just the presence of this tool itself, and then once we connect over using this tool, can we open up the Active Directory database? Okay, and so far so good. The tool exists. We see our domain with the proper domain name. We see our typical default containers, built-in computers, our default OU domain controllers here. So everything looks good. You see server 1's listed underneath domain controllers. There are no other computers in this domain right now, and miscellaneous users and groups here. Okay, so this all looks good as far as checking out Active Directory is concerned. Now, some other things we want to check for. Let's make sure the database is present, and at this point right now it would be hard to believe that the database wouldn't be present. Otherwise we'd have a hard time opening up that Active Directory users and computers tool, because that's what it connects to, is this database we're about to go look at. Okay, and this is located in Server 2003. This is in the Windows directory, but in 2000 this would be located in your WinNT directory. Keep in mind we have switched default directories in Server 2003. So when I open this up, we're going to go down to the NTDS folder, and this is the same in 2000. And if I open this up, I see a file here, ntds.dit. Okay, and this represents our database file. This is the actual Active Directory database. However, I can't open this up itself. I can't really manipulate this file, by double-clicking or trying to open up in Notepad or something. That's not how it works. This file is accessed by using the default tools that we see here, Active Directory users and computers, Active Directory sites and services, as well as some command line tools as well. There's a protocol, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, that's actually used to access this particular database, and that's how that works. Okay, some other things we should check for. Well, we want to check out DNS. We want to make sure that DNS is set up and DNS looks okay, so let's go take a look at that next. So we're going to open up DNS, and I just have a shortcut here because we've opened it up recently. Okay, and if we open this, there's several things that we want to look for. Number one, we still have our forward lookup zone. That looks good. And we see that we have server 1 here listed. Okay, and this should be here, of course, because this is something that we had actually set up previous to installing Active Directory on this machine. However, these weren't here before, okay, and these are something that you definitely want to check for. This will cause problems. These are SRV folders, and this is where different SRV, server resource locator records, are located. Don't worry about them too much right now, except for the mere fact that these folders exist. Okay, without these folders, you're going to have some sort of Active Directory issues in the future. Okay, so they're there. That's good. And then another thing we want to look at, let's go ahead and right-click this DNS domain name, okay, the zone, and we're going to go down to Properties. Okay, and right here, this is something that we were going through before when we set up DNS. Currently, this benandbrady.com zone is set up as a primary. Okay, and if you don't know too much about DNS, this is definitely something that you want to spend some more time on. We go over this in great depth in our DNS course if you haven't already looked at this. But this is something that's fairly critical to have a good understanding of. Active Directory and DNS are really the backbones that make up 2000 and 2003. However, what we have right now, we had a primary zone is what we set up. And we were talking about this before, that we were kind of forced into allowing non-secure and secure dynamic updates. Well, what we can do is take advantage of a new feature in 2000 and Server 2003 called Active Directory Integrated Zones. Okay, and that's what we're going to do right here just by selecting this box down below. Store the zone in Active Directory. Okay, and it tells us this is only possible if the DNS server is a domain controller. Okay, only possible if the DNS server is a domain controller. So I click OK here. It asks us, just confirms that we want to do this. Okay, and it's pretty, not eventful as far as what's going on here. It's now changed to Active Directory Integrated. But one thing we can now do, if you look under Dynamic Updates, we can now switch this to Secure Only, and this option was not available before when it was just a primary zone. Okay, so I select Secure Only, and we can move forward from here now that this is Active Directory Integrated. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is work on joining our two other computers in this setup to the domain. So we currently have one domain controller, that's the Server 1 machine that we were sitting on. What I'd like to do is join this XP machine to the domain, as well as joining Server 11, our second server 2003 server, I'd like to join that to the domain as well. So what we'll do here, I'm going to come up to my computer and recall that we just renamed this just by right-clicking and clicking on rename, but this is the My Computer icon. I'm going to right-click this, go to Properties, then go to Computer Name, and what I'm going to do here is actually click Change, and we're going to attempt to join this domain that we just set up here. Okay, now if we type in Ben and Brady, this should work. This is a NetBIOS name, and what we'll do is we'll do a query across the local network here looking for a domain named Ben and Brady. And this is done in the NetBIOS fashion, meaning we don't have that .com here appended to the end. This will work, but I do recommend that you set up Ben and Brady and actually put the full DNS name. Okay, and the reason, well, this will almost always work on a local network, even if DNS is not set up correctly. If you set it up this way and you actually type in benandbrady.com, what this is forcing this domain to do is to search for the domain using a host name. And if you don't have DNS configured properly, then this is not going to work. So this is kind of be a telltale sign to you as to whether or not you set up DNS properly on this local system. So we're just going to click OK here. Okay, and you see that it does connect out to a server. This is a good thing. If you get to this point right here, it means that it has found a domain controller that exists for this domain. Now it's up to you to supply a username and a password. And since you're joining a domain, it's very important to remember this has got to be a domain administrator, okay, or an enterprise admin. This can't be the local admin account from this XP machine that we're sitting on here. Okay? Let me repeat that just to make sure that you get a good feel for that. Remember, every local machine, such as an XP machine or a Windows 2000 Pro machine, they have their own local user account database. There's an administrator that exists locally on the system, just as if you're using your system at home, you can be the administrator on that system. However, if you're joining a domain, it doesn't make sense that you could join the domain using your local administrator account. That would mean that anybody sitting at their own computers in a company could kind of bring a system in, okay, and since they're a local admin, they could join their computer to the domain. It doesn't work that way. What you really need to use here is a domain admin or a enterprise admin user account. Okay, and in this case, it's administrator, and we just have a real simple setup. So we've got a non-secure password. Okay, and we just enter in those credentials. But those credentials that I supplied are going out to the domain controller. They're looking within the Active Directory database to see if those credentials provided are, indeed from a domain admin or an enterprise admin. Okay, and they are. Welcome to the benandbrady.com domain. This machine has been set up here. So now what's going to happen, we're going to have to restart this computer. Okay, and before we do that, we're going to have to stop this video because this is where the video is actually starting from. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And I'm going to stop the video right now, and we'll pick right back up again once the system has rebooted. Okay, the XP machine is back up and running, and we've logged on here. Next thing we're going to do is start working on Server 11, the machine that's potentially going to be our second domain controller in the benandbrady.com domain. Now we have a couple options here, and I think what we'll do first is just connect over here before we start talking about these. Okay, so we're using a remote desktop connection, and I'm just specifying the NetBIOS name. You could, of course, use the IP address, which is 192.168.1.211.211. Now, when we connect over here, really our options are a couple. And let's kind of relate this to a real-world scenario. You may be in a situation where maybe this machine was already running and functioning in the domain as a member server. So you made this machine a member server and it's been sharing files. Maybe it's acting as a DNS server. Maybe it's acting as a print server, or even all of the above. So if it's a member server already, you could go ahead and run DC promo still and actually join this machine to the domain with relatively few problems. Okay, it'd just be really similar to what we saw a second ago when we ran the DC promo process with a couple different changes that we will cover here in a second. Another alternative is kind of like we have right now. Okay, if we go take a look, just so we're able to visually differentiate what we're talking about here, this machine is currently just part of a work group named Workgroup, okay, and this really means nothing to us. We're not part of that benandbrady.com domain, so that means we're not able to participate in centralized authentication and centralized security and all the benefits that we enjoy when we're part of a domain. Now, what we could do is go straight to making this machine a domain controller. Okay, so what I'm saying is, instead of doing it this way, we're actually making this machine a member of the domain first and foremost, or first I should say, not necessarily first and foremost. We could just run DC promo. Okay, so I can, right from here, type in DC promo, okay, and start this domain controller installation process. Now this might be more appropriate. Let's say that we installed this machine, we get it up and running, we know right away that it's going to be a domain controller. That's why we installed it. In that case, I guess there's really not a huge reason to make this machine a member server first and then promote it up to a domain controller. So I just want to make sure that you know that you do have the option regardless of which way your server currently exists. Now, one potential problem you will run into here though is the actual same thing we kind of had before. And that's regarding the actual name of the server currently. Let's go take a look at what I mean by this. If I look right here at my computer name, it's just plain old server 11. Let's take a closer look. If I click more, I see that it does not currently have a primary DNS suffix, so this is not server11.benandbrady.com. So what ends up happening here, this machine's not currently able to register itself within the DNS zone that we have set up over on server 1. Remember that zone we set up before, benandbrady.com, and server 1 is currently registered in there? server1.benandbrady.com. Well, this machine has not registered itself because it's going out and it's attempting to register with the DNS server, but it's not saying that it's part of the benandbrady.com domain. It just says, hey, I'm server 11, can you register me? And there's nowhere over on that DNS server for this machine to be placed. Okay, so what ends up happening here, if we went through and we actually ran the DC promo process at this time right now, it's going to fail. It's not going to work because this machine currently does not show itself as part of the DNS zone, benandbrady.com. So what are our choices here? We really have one of two choices. There's some others, but we'll just focus on these two. We could set this up just like we did before. Okay, benandbrady.com. If I click OK here a couple times, it will require a reboot of this machine. And then when that happens, we'll be back up and running, and we can run DC promo with no problem on this machine at that point. Another option, we can just join the domain and make ourselves a member server first. It's really not doing anything different than what we did here. It's just making this machine a member server first, and then immediately, right after we reboot, then we could run DC promo and have this machine join the domain. Okay, because keep in mind what would happen. If I went ahead and went about it going this way, I'll be asked to authenticate myself with the domain. No problem. I'll have to put in a domain admin password like we did a second ago. And then what will happen after that is when this computer reboots, it'll automatically now take on this name. It'll assume that it should be server11.benandbrady.com. Why? Because we joined this computer to the domain. Okay, so either way is going to work. Okay, either doing it the way we showed a second ago or just joining the domain as a member server. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually go ahead and do it the second way because I want to show you one thing prior to making this machine a domain controller, and that's to make sure that you understand the appropriate logon process. So we'll get to that in a second though. For right now, what we're going to do, we're going to join the domain. So server 11 is not going to be a domain controller. Keep in mind this does not make this machine a domain controller. It makes it a member server of the benandbrady.com domain. So I click OK. I'm asked to authenticate just as I was before on the XP machine. I am normally a pretty good typer, but trying to record and type at the same time, not an easy task. I forgot my R up here, administrator. Okay, click OK. We'll give it a couple seconds here, and hopefully this machine will authenticate, be checked out, and then be welcomed to the Ben and Brady domain here in a second. Then what we'll have to do, we will stop the video once again after this machine starts its reboot process, and we'll start it back up as soon as the machine comes back up and running. So we'll go ahead and stop the video right now, and then we'll pick it right back up as soon as server 11 has rebooted. Okay, server 11 has rebooted, so we're going to connect back over using a remote desktop connection. And as we're connecting over here, I do want to demonstrate one thing to you. When the computer first comes up, and this would either be with the XP machine or when you're booting up this member server, you see a screen that looks similar to this where you can only supply the username and password. It's very important that you do select options here then hit the drop down arrow and make sure that server 11, this computer, this is just the computer name, make sure this is not selected. Going forward, you do want to log on to the domain, okay, and this is logging on using the local user accounts here, so you don't want to do this anymore. And this, by the way, is the default option. So if you just supply a username and a password here, you're going to be logging on to the local user accounts, or trying to access that local user account database. So I'm going to select options, drop down arrow, choose the domain, and now I'm supplying credentials that will be checked within Active Directory users and computers. So we're going actually over to server 1 and checking with server 1 to see if these credentials exist. Okay, so we log on with our administrator name and password, and now we're logging on to our server 2003 machine. That was just an activation window, by the way, asking us to activate our product. So we're not going to activate it right now. It's a fairly straightforward process. Okay, now once we're up here, what we'll do is first take a look at what we changed previous. So I'm going to go up here, right-click on server 11, and then go to Properties. And here when we look at computer name now, you see that the computer name is server11.benandbrady.com. And this is what we're looking for. I told you before you had the option of either selecting typing this out here, so you have the full DNS suffix included, or you could just join the domain. And what happens in this case, now this is just appended to it automatically because this machine is part of the domain. So I'm going to go ahead now, and we're ready to start the DC promo process. We're going to make this machine, which is currently a member server, we're going to promote it using DC promo and install Active Directory. So here I just do the exact same thing. I'm typing in DC promo. Okay, and this, we run into an issue right here because we don't have any drives formatted with NTFS. So what we need to do in this case, I just re-image this system. It has a fat partition. So what I'll have to do is actually stop this video and then format this partition using NTFS. And what I'll do, I'm going to go ahead and show you how this works. If you're working with Ghost and using imaging tools, you may run across this and you may be confused as to how to handle this. Okay, and just to describe the basic problem, all of my Server 2003 images here are actually done in FAT or FAT32, and most of the features within 2000 and 2003 do require an NTFS file system. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just convert my file system up to NTFS. Okay, and the command you use, convert the actual drive that you want to convert, so I'm converting the C drive. Okay, then I do a /fs for file system. Then I enter the colon, and then what type of file system we're converting to. Okay, so the full syntax then is convert, drive you want to convert, this is my C partition or C drive, space, /fs to specify the file system, colon, and then what file system we're converting to. So I hit enter here, and it basically tells me that it can't do this currently, and that's because right now we're actually running within this operating system, so it can't do it while we're running 2003. So I'm just going to say, would you like to force a dismount on this volume? I say yes. Okay, and now it says it still cannot gain exclusive access to the C drive. Can't convert now. Would you like to schedule it to be converted the next time the system restarts? I'm going to say yes here. Okay, and that's all that you need to do. Except that we would have to restart this system before this is going to take place. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to have this system restart. It'll restart, convert to NTFS, and when it comes back up again, we'll be ready to enter DC promo once again and continue right from where we left off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, and I'll restart it while we're down. We'll be right back up again. Okay, we're back up and running now, so we're going to connect right back over again and start from where we left off. Okay, and if you don't recall, remember the reason we got that error message, you must have at least one NTFS partition on your server that you're going to make a domain controller. Okay, so an NTFS partition is required. So we're going to log on the exact same way we did before. Okay, and eventually we'll log on here. One thing that'll probably pop up again here is the activation notice, and just to give you some insight, if you get an evaluation copy of Server 2003, you only have a certain number of times that you can actually install it. We tend to re-image over and over and over and over again, so that serial number is used up. So the fewer times you activate it, the better from a practice standpoint, okay? Because otherwise you'll have to go out and get a new evaluation copy with a new product ID, which isn't the biggest deal in the world, but it can be a hassle. Okay, let's pick up from where we left off then. We're just going to run DC promo once again. And now you see we don't get an error message when the DC promo process starts. Okay, and that's because it's gone out. It senses that we do have a NTFS partition, so we can continue. So I'm going to click Next. We get that same issue here, warning us about operating system compatibility. And recall, this is just to let you know that Windows 95 and NT4 Service Pack 3 or earlier machines will not be able to connect to a Server 2003 network. So if you're running these operating systems in your network, you'll have to upgrade them. Now, here's the big change here. We're going to be doing an additional domain controller for an already existing domain. And this is important. If you do a domain controller for a new domain, you're essentially going to be forming two different companies per se. This machine's not going to be part of the other one, and that's not what we want in this case. We want to create the second domain controller for this domain. So we choose the bottom option and then click Next. Okay, username and password. Okay, so it tells us right here exactly what this is for. Type the username, password, and domain of an account with sufficient privileges to install Active Directory on this computer. So it's not necessarily going to be a local machine, but you also have to provide credentials that are going to work over the domain. Okay, so I'm going to be providing my domain administrator privileges from the benandbrady.com domain. Okay, and the username there is administrator. Okay, then I click Next, and now it's time to specify the actual domain that we're going to be connecting to. So the domain name is benandbrady.com. If you needed to browse, you could browse and see what available domains are out there on the network. This is the only one, though, so it's a pretty easy choice. So I click Next. Then we get the choice of where we're going to store the Active Directory database and the Active Directory log file. These can be stored anywhere. Once again, separate partitions is recommended for each of these just for performance issues. Okay, the sysfile folder. And this is the key here. Sysfile folder must be located in an NTFS volume. And that's one of the reasons why we have to have that NTFS partition from the get-go. So if I wanted to put this on, let's say, my D drive and that was fat, it's not going to happen. It must be located on an NTFS volume. Okay, restore mode password. You can use anything you want here, as long as your passwords match. Okay, and then, password does not meet complexity requirements. So what I'm having to do here is put in a password that has an uppercase, lowercase, symbol, or number, 3 out of those 4. So I'm going to go ahead and supply the normal secure password that I use in this situation. Okay, so we've gotten to this point right here. Configure the server as an additional domain controller for the domain, benandbrady.com. Now it's going to go out across the network, search for this domain controller, and if it finds it and everything goes okay, it's going to start copying the Active Directory database from server 1 over here to server 11. And maybe that's something we didn't stress quite enough, but that's what's happening here. It's not that we're creating a new Active Directory database. We're copying the Active Directory database that already exists on server 1, and it's being copied over to server 11. Okay, and that's what you see right here. This is representing our domain, and then the information's being copied from here over into our new server. Okay, so just a graphical picture, but it can tell us a little bit about what's actually going on in this particular process. Okay, this will take about 10 or 15 minutes or so, so I'm going to stop this video while this is running. When it finishes and I've rebooted the system, we'll restart right from there and we'll continue on with this discussion. Okay, Server 11 has rebooted and Active Directory should be installed. So what we're going to do is form a remote desktop connection over to Server 11 and we're going to check it out. Let's go see if Server 11 indeed has Active Directory on there and if it's functioning correctly. Okay, so we log on to Server 11, and we're going to look at the same types of things we looked at when we checked out Server 1. So the first thing we'll look at, let's go check out the database file itself. Let's see if the Active Directory database file indeed exists. So we go over to C, Windows. Now we're looking for the ntds directory, and then the ntds.dit file. Okay, and that's indeed what we see right here is the ntds.dit file. So that's the Active Directory database, so that checks out. Now let's see if we can open up Active Directory users and computers. Okay, and this does exist here, so that's a good thing. Okay, we've got the domain name. If we look over in domain controllers, we see server 1 and server 11 now, so that's good as well. XP is listed here as one of the just normal computers. So we see all this different information here. So everything looks pretty good right now. Now, the final part of this first lab, what we want to do is test out replication. We want to get a real good feel as to whether or not replication is working, and then for you, exactly how replication works. So keep in mind that anytime we have two domain controllers in the same domain, that they're going to be replicating the Active Directory database information back and forth. So what we should see here is if we create a user over here on server 11, this should be replicated to server 1. Okay, so let's try this out. I'm going to right click, go to New, User, and we're going to create a user named Ben Smith, as you see here. Okay, then next, and finish. Okay, so anytime you create a user on server 11, it should be replicated over to server 1, and then vice versa as well. If I create a user on server 1, that should then be replicated over to server 11. So we'll do the same thing. We'll form a remote desktop connection over to server 1. And on server 1, what we're going to do is first check for replication, see if that actually has occurred. And then after we do that, we're going to create another user account, Brady Jones, and attempt to replicate that back over to server 11. Okay, so I'm opening up Active Directory users and computers. Okay, and I look right now and I do see that Ben Smith has already replicated over. Sometimes it happens fairly quickly, sometimes it takes much longer for that replication process to occur. So it can take anywhere between a minute and 5 minutes, possibly even slower if you're over a wide area connection. Just really all depends. So and there's some other configuration settings that you can stipulate as well that can make a difference. Okay, but on average, on a local network where you really have nothing extra configured, where you just set up two domain controllers just as we did, you're talking about a minute or 2 minutes is probably the average amount of time it takes for replication to occur. Okay, so on this side, let's go ahead and create a user account and we'll test how quickly it happens. Because instead of talking so much after we do this, what I'll do is we'll go right back over to the other machine. Okay, so we'll go right back over to that other machine and we'll check and see if this user account that I just created right now, Brady Jones, exists there. Okay, so I'm going over to server 11, and to really be fair, we got to close this and reopen it. Okay, and right now it has not appeared there yet, so we see nothing. We could keep doing this, of course, and eventually it will show up. Won't take very long either. We can close the Active Directory altogether and then try to reopen it. Okay, and we still don't see Brady Jones, so you can see it doesn't happen instantaneously. An alternative, and something that you should be aware of, though, is you can force replication. This is really useful. Oops, a little bit too far out. This is really useful in cases where replication doesn't seem to be working and you want to check it out. Okay, so to do this, we go into Active Directory Sites and Services, and then we have to drill down and actually open up one of these particular servers. And you see that we have both server 1 and server 11 listed here under our default first site name. Okay, and we won't get into sites right now, but there is just one site name by default, and it's called default first site name, like you see. You will see all of your different domain controllers in a domain listed. Okay, so we see server 1 and server 11 here. And then you need to know which one to go to. Okay, and the way to be able to tell, if you want to force replication to take place from server 11 to server 1, well then we're in the right place right here. We're actually trying to make replication take place from server 1 to server 11. So what we need to do here is select this connection, right click it, and then select Replicate Now. Okay, and now it gives you a message, Active Directory has replicated the connections. So if replication hadn't taken place already while we were doing all this talking, we should see it now when I refresh. Okay, and it's not showing up. Let me close this tool and then reopen it. It might take that before we can see it. Okay, and now we see Brady Jones has appeared within our Active Directory user list. Okay, and the same thing will happen back and forth. We can keep creating users on either side, and we should see those users appear on the other side. Okay, so server 11 has both of these users, Ben Smith and Brady Jones, and if we check over with server 1, we should see the same user accounts here. Okay, now this is going to work no matter which way we slice it. Okay, if we create OUs, groups, so on and so forth, you'll see both of these appear within all the different domain controllers in this particular domain. And that's the process of Active Directory replication and exactly how it works. Okay, that wraps up Lab 1. We'll see you back here shortly for Lab 2 when we start talking about organizational units and then how to delegate permissions down to different users in Server 2003.